So welcome back to another episode. Thanks for joining me, and you've seen this car now. We've walked around it, we've checked all the spec out, and now it's time to do some work on it. So obviously I didn't build this engine, and the engine bay is very untidy. What I've just done is remove this cold air feed that was covering up this whole area here, and I understand why he put this in there. It was basically nothing to do with the air filter at all. It was just to cover up all this wiring, because this went down here and actually didn't go anywhere. So you can see underneath the wiring you've got this max solenoid, which is absolutely fine, but you've got this blitz boost controller as well, all this wiring, nasty taping up. But the most important part at the minute, obviously I didn't build this engine, so I'm going to take the cam cover off, going to do a compression test, check the plugs, going to take the sump off, make sure all the bearings are good, drain the oil out, check the oil filter, I'll probably cut that open, make sure the oil, there's no bits of metal in the oil before we go any further, and basically give the car a general health check. So at the minute we've got a slight ticking noise, so I've just used my tool and it's coming from this bottom right hand side on the end one here. So we're going to take the cam cover off and check what's going on. We might need to put some new lash adjusters in it. It's got uprated ones in it at the minute, but I just want to check them over. So I think first things first is I'm going to take these plugs out. I don't even know what plugs it's got in it at the minute. Check everything over, make sure that they're burning correctly, and while they're out I'm going to do a compression test. So this is funny, for number 2 and 4 where the coil pack sits on the top, looks like someone's just glued the rubber boot in. You can see this is where the spring sits in the middle of the coil and transfers the electricity down to the spark plug. So we're going to have to address that issue, trying to pull them out in a minute. Right, so the plugs are out and they're an 8 grade plug, which is fine, and they're burning okay. They're obviously a bit rich, you can see they're quite sooted up, but you can smell that in the mixture anyway. The AFR's on idle a little bit rich, and it's only really been cold started for a while, so it's perfectly expected. It hasn't been taken out for a boost. So I'm going to do a compression test on it now, might as well where the plugs are out. You can see I've just undone all the injectors. You can also do that by taking out the fuel pump relay, but it's just quicker and easier for me to do that so we don't flood the cylinders while we're doing it. So I just finished doing a compression test and every cylinder is bang on 12 bar perfectly, which is quite nice to see. Absolutely none uneven cylinders. When you're doing a compression test, make sure that you hold down the throttle body, whether it's electronic or cable. If it's electronic, you're going to have to do it from in the car. If it's cable, you can hold it from in the engine bay to let the maximum amount of air flow into the cylinder. So I'm going to pull this cam cover off now. Let's get to stripping this down so you can see inside the engine. So this is the inside of a cam cover of a 4G63 engine. You can see the oil is very nasty and dark. That's because it's been over fueling. You can smell it. I know you can't smell, but there's fuel in the oil, which makes the oil thin. It also looks like this wasn't greatly cleaned as well when it was built, because there's still like hardened carbon deposits on it. So they normally put them in like a hot tank, but they never do the job, and I always give them a proper clean when they come back from the machiners. You can see that these engines run on an old style rocker cover design, which is like similar to how the CVH runs, but it doesn't run like a camshaft directly over the top of a bucket like a Supra or a Z20 Let. You see it runs a Lash adjuster, which is down there, which is basically a hydraulic lifter, and then that pushes down on the valve spring retainer itself. So as you can see here, I stripped the front end down, I've pulled the bumper off, I pulled the headlights off, but I put them back in, indicators are out. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get underneath it and drop the oil out, drop the oil filter off, drain the oil, filter it, make sure that there's no metal or anything in the oil. So I'm going to drop that off now. You can see we've got the adapter plate as well on the oil filter. We've got a pressure gauge at the back that I've got to check why that ain't working at the minute. Probably the sensor, a bit of wiring. While I'm under here, you can see the dam pipe. So you can see the elbow is that true 3-inch elbow with a nice big wastegate port as well. So you can see that elbow's got loads of flow. The problem with these elbows on these Mitsubishi Evos is they're really poor flowing. So if you can get yourself an uprated one, it will help turbo spool massively. You can see we've got a full 3-inch system under there. So let's get to dropping this oil out. Right, so I've just drained the oil out the Evo, and what I've done is I've put it into a nice clean bucket, and so there's no contamination in it. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to strain it through a paint filter, and then I'll be able to check in the bottom of the filter that there's any sort of oil. This goes down to silly microns, 125 microns. So I'm going to pour it through here now while I'm pouring it away, and I'll be able to see if there's any contaminants in the oil. So that's the last of the oil just draining through. Now it looks good because when it gets any sort of like material in the oils, the filter will actually get blocked and the oil won't drain through. But that is all 5 or 6 litres of the oil that's come out of it, including the oil cooler, and it's still draining through. So we're going to have a look as soon as that's done. So that's the oil all filtered down, and you can see there's very little, if anything, material in there, and this goes down to really fine microns. So if there was any sort of contaminants in that oil, it would have filtered it out. So I'm very happy with that. So next process is we're going to be replacing these lash adjusters. So on these cars they call them lash adjusters. They're basically just tappets, hydraulic tappets. You can see on the 4G63 they run on a roller rocker arm system. So the cam sits over the top of the rocker arm, and then the tappet or lash adjuster sits in there. I'm going to replace these because I don't know which ones they're on here. I think they're supposed to be 3mm ones, but until I take them out I have no idea. But they're starting to get a little bit noisy. Obviously high revs on these cars, they're prone for ticking on the top end. So I've ordered some new ones, some proper genuine ones with the 3mm holes. So I've just removed the 4-inch intake off the car just for 2 reasons really. Just wanted to have a look inside it, make sure there was nothing in there. You see it's clean as a whistle in there. Really nice item this is as well. You see it goes from 3-inch to 4-inch as well for the compressor housing, and also I wanted to check the turbo. So you can see in here the turbo had not long been rebuilt. It's got an anti-surge housing, and I checked it for play, and it's got absolutely no play, no side to side or no in and out, which is really good. And you can see that nice big compressor wheel in there. This is going to flow a lot of air in the future, allow us to produce some nice power. So I've never used one of these FP Blacks before, but I've heard good reviews about them, and it was coming on boost. It was already on boost by around 3,500 RPM because it's obviously the 2.3 stroker, so no lag at all. So first things first, going to pull off the auxiliary belt. This is the tensioner here for the auxiliary belt, you can see, and that's the crank pulley. And you can see they've got like the square sockets in them. But one thing I've just noticed is you can see on this one, someone's already someone has not used a proper tool, and they've gone in there and they've cracked it. You can see how it's supposed to be, this square, and you can just get an extension in there. So that's going to make it a little bit more difficult, but get around it. So what you're supposed to be using on them is these sockets with the square ends on them. But ironically, what happens is these are a perfect size. I don't know if that was on purpose or not. And then people end up using these extensions like this, and what happens is it puts too much side load on the socket. And as that one on the tension is only aluminium, it's put side load on it and cracked the side of it. If you're going to do it properly. Use these proper sockets, and that way you don't put any sort of side load on it. You can put it right up to here. You can see you can just crack them off nice and easy. So don't be tempted to take a shortcut. While the auxiliary belt's off, we're going to change it for a new item as well. Whenever you're using belts, cam belts, auxiliary belts, try to use gates. They're normally the original equipment manufacturer belts. Right, so it's time to remove these lash adjusters or lifters or whatever you want to call them. And what I always do is I use the unloaded cam. So when I say the unloaded, it's the back of the lobe. So this is the lobe that produces the lift, and this is the unloaded cam. If you're ever adjusting lash or anything on a solid lifter, this is when you want to do it. You can see clearly on here that they're Kelford cams. I can tell you they're 272-degree cams, and you can see in here, you'll be able to see even more clearly when the rocker's off. You've got the titanium retainers and the uprated springs. We're leaving all the cam belt and everything on to do this. It's a fiddly job, but it's a lot less hassle than taking this cam belt off, especially as hardly any room down the side here. If it needed to be done, it would be, but we can remove these just by removing the rocker arms. It's a little bit fiddly, but we're going to get on with that now. So it's funny, when you do work on cars, you can always see that work that's been done in the past, if it ain't been up to standard. You can see here where they've used pry bars to get these off instead of doing it with a proper way. And it just like wears away at this, and it stops these sealing properly. So to counter that, they've had to use sealant. You can see there like the flattened down edges. So as you start removing these, you can see I've started to remove the rockers already, and the lifter literally just pulls out then. You can see easy enough. I'll just leave them in till the end, and then what you do is you turn the crankshaft, and then that turns the cam, and you can unload the next set of lifters. So you can see these are the next two to come out. Right, so all the lifters and all the rockers are removed all along here now. The only ones I've left in are the ones I suspected. So it was either this bank or this bank. It's quite difficult to tell, but I'm pretty sure it was these two banks here. So their ones are going to be specially removed, and I'll be checking them properly just to make sure. Good thing with opening up the engine as well, as you can see all the parts. So you've got the H11 head stud down there as well, so we've got all the stuff that it said it's going to have. So we're going to remove the sump off now and make sure we've got all the crank and the I-beams. We've got loads of pictures of the build, but you can never be sure. It's always worth checking. So all 16 rockers and lash adjusters are out now. You can see these were the 3mm uprated ones. You can see by the size of the oil way in it. But we found that 2 was dead. You can see here, these are the little mini roller rockers, and they've got like a little oil way in the end of them. So I'll show you them up close. Now what you want to check with these is, you see that little oil way there, you want to put some metal through there and make sure that's clear. Sometimes they get gunked up and that stops the oil flow through them. And also, I'll show you a little trick how to bleed these lifters. If you're worried about them being clogged up, if the spring hasn't collapsed inside them, you can just bleed them with diesel. So you put them, submerge them into diesel, and I'll show you quickly how you get the plunger to work. So this is the lifter, also known as a lash adjuster, and all it's doing is taking up the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve retainer itself. So the way to bleed these out is get yourself an Allen key, a 3mm one that goes in this hole, and you'll wiggle it around like this, and you'll see it drop in like that. And once it drops in, just give it a push, and you can see all the oil spurts out of it. Now just keep doing that, plunge it up and down, and then what to do is get a tub of diesel, and then put this inside the tub of diesel, do the same thing, squirt it in and out like that, get all the oil out of it, all the gunk out of it, and as long as that plunger stays up and it hasn't collapsed like that, and it's all nice and cleaned out, then ones are good to go again. But there's 2 of them on this engine that have actually collapsed, and the spring inside and the ball bearings all collapsed, probably because they're cheap lifters, I'm not sure, but we've got some nice new ones coming. So I found a dead lifter, and it's exactly the one I thought it was going to be. It's kind of weird as well. When I've removed the oil, you can see there's like little tiny rust pittings. That means that when before these were put in, they weren't stored properly. So they was either not put in oil, or they was wiped down and left out into exposure. You can see the rust marks in there, so it's no wonder that it's probably rusted up inside, or it's got water or something in it. I'm going to show you how you can bleed these and check that it's the knackered one. Next, it's time to check this bottom end out, so that means removing the sump. Got to remove the downpipe first, start a motor, and you can see the oil return feed as well. It's attached to the sump, so that's got to come off. Once that's off, it's just a couple of fancy Allen key bolts that they've used, like dress up ones, and this is just stuck on with sealant, so shouldn't be too difficult. Right, so the starter motor's off and the downpipe's off. It was a little bit more difficult than it should have been because people had been using completely the wrong bolts, so I had to loosen off all the engine mounts and everything and then pry it up, because there was a bolt head around here. You can still see it, but the problem was you couldn't get a socket in there because it was wedged between the gearbox bell housing and the cross member. But a good point, while I was under here, I looked inside the inspection cover, and you can see it's clearly got the Exede extreme trim plate that's in there. It's got the big purple housing on there. I've had a look through with a torch, and you can clearly see it's definitely what it says it is. The sump, I've also removed the baffling plate as well from the bottom of the crank, and I've removed the oil pickup pipe as well, just so we can see in the bottom end and see actually what we've got inside there. So you can see here we've got the uprated I-beam rods, and you can see we've got the ARP 2000 bolts in there as well, so everything looks good there. Clearly see there we've got the ARP main cap studs as well. Can't really see up there, but there's the pistons, so we've definitely got all the forged stuff that we're supposed to have in this block. So the last things to check under here are the big end bearings. So I'm going to take off this rod cap and take the rod bolts out and check the bearings and see what sort of wear we got on them. If you're removing rod caps from an engine when it's up in the air, it's going to be difficult to separate the joint between the two. And what you do is you loosen off the bolts like this on either side, but don't loosen them off too much. Then get yourself a rubber hammer, and you can just tap on them bolts, and it pushes the rod upwards and it separates the caps like so. And once you give it a tap, it will just fall onto the bolts like that. You can see literally, then you just undo the bolts one at a time. I'm going to do this with the all the rods, check all the bearings on them, check for any signs of wear. So once the cap's off, and you can have a look at the journal, see if you've got any scores on it, and you can take the bearing, you can just push the rod up a little bit like that, and you can get the other bearing out. So we've got some bad news for the Evo engine. You can see here I've removed all the rod bearings and the rod caps, and all the bearings just had the normal general wear that they would have on them, especially for a high power engine like this. This is number 1. Make sure you always label up the caps. The rods can't go onto different caps, and they're all machined properly for tolerances. So you can see number 1, number 4. And we got to number 4, which was the last one. Everything was going well, and you can clearly see we have a spun bearing. So this is the bearing that came out of number 4 cylinder. So it's dried up. I'll give you a quick run through of why I think this has happened. So this is the view from underneath. Now you can see here, this is clearly what a polished normal big end bearing would look like. You can see here, highly polished, nice and smooth, no markings or anything in it, no damage. And you get along here to rod 4, and you can see how damaged that bearing is. So you can see that the journal itself is all tore up. There's loads of grooves and that in it. If you listen, you can hear my finger running across it. That means that this needs to either be reground or a new crank put in. So I don't like to use reground cranks on really high power engines unless they've been rehardened. So we're going to probably scrap this crank. This is a 4G64 crank. We're going to get a new crank for it, and we're going to pull this engine out and do a rebuild on it. So you might be wondering why the reason that I've done all these checks on this engine is because a DIYer, someone who thought they knew what they was doing, done an oil change on this car, and it was just sitting for a long time, so it never got up to temperature. And as you could tell for the oil, it got black because it was sooted up because it was only on cold start. So the oil never got up to temperature, and you can see we've got a oil cooler. So this oil cooler is thermostatically controlled, and you can see here it's a big oil cooler as well, so it takes around 2 litres for the whole lines and the oil cooler itself. What happened was someone done an oil change on it, and it never got up to temperature. And then as soon as it got up to temperature, obviously they adjusted the oil level to the perfect oil level. When it got up to temperature, when it was driving, it filled the oil cooler up like it should do, but that sucked around a litre and a half or 2 litres of oil out the sump. And that is why, as soon as that happened, we got these rattles. Now the rattles we thought was lifters. There was 2 lifters that were collapsed down to low oil pressure, but as you just seen there, the big end bearing suffered as well. So now this engine's going to have to come out. So in the next episode, I'm going to start stripping this engine down. So this is an interesting part. You can see that obviously I've done that full drain of the oil, but you can see how much stays in the pan. There's still a lot of oil in there that doesn't get drained off. And when I was tipping out the oil, I'll drain it out because you can't see it with the oil in, and you'll be able to see that there's bearing fragments in the bottom there that you would never be able to see from draining the oil out. So I've just drained out the rest of the oil, and just about see, I've just pulled it out from out the sump. There's little chunks of bearing here. So it looks like we caught it just in time because the engine's definitely not trashed. There's only like a few odd bits down there off the bearing. Most of the bearing stayed intact. So I'm hoping this episode helped you out in diagnosing any sort of faults that you've got with your engine. We're going to get to pulling this engine out now and rebuild it. It's only an engine, you know, we get it running in no time, get it back up to scratch. And the good thing about it is I know it's built properly then because I've built it myself. And we're going to be able to push this engine. I want to get well over 600 horsepower with it. The plan is we're going to max out this turbo. First off, obviously we need to change the inlet and injectors, but we're going to go for a map on the same spec that it's on now. Just going to give it another freshen up build and then take it straight for mapping. Obviously while the engine's out as well, I can tidy up a lot of like stuff, all this stupid stuff. This is all coming off, you know, all this dress up kit. The wiring can be all moved out the way as well and tidied up a lot, so it makes it a bit of a blessing in disguise. We'll be able to do a much better job of it now. So hope you join in for the next episode.